Their last moments tell us something powerful about God as justice and perfect timing, something that will make you wonder how many times we ignore His warnings in our own lives. These men were feared, respected, and in control. But in the end, even they couldn't outrun the judgment that was already coming for them. So, let me ask you, have you ever thought about what it really means to defy God's will? Have you ever felt the weight of judgment hanging over you? If this stirs something deep inside, type 777 in the comments to declare that you're ready to hear the full story of their downfall. What you're about to discover may shock you, but it. Essay truth we all need to hear. This is the chilling fate of Caiphas and Annas, two men who believed they could silence God, but learned too late that His justice always wins. Now picture this. In Jerusalem, the most powerful man wasn't the one in lavish robes, greeted with bows from the people. No, the real power was hidden. It was Annas, the puppet master. He didn't need to stand in the spotlight. With a single whisper, he could move the entire city. Leaders came and went, but Annas stayed pulling the strings, weaving a web of influence that few could even understand. Annas first became high priest around the year 06 AD. Normally, that title would seal a man's place in history. But when the Romans took it away, it wasn't the end. For him, it was just the beginning. Because Annas had something far more valuable than a title. He had control. He placed his own sons in the role of high priest, one after another, making sure the family's grip on power never slipped. But his most brilliant move came when he put his son-in-law Caiphas in the position. Caiphas would hold a title longer than anyone else, locking the family's influence over Jerusalem for decades. But here's the twist. What if Caiphas wasn't really in charge? What if Annas was still the one calling the shots from the shadows? Imagine the chilling truth. While everyone thought they were following a leader, the real master was hidden in the background, untouchable. Their wealth and power came from the coins poured into the temple, from sacrifices, coins collected from every pilgrim seeking forgiveness or peace with God. Without knowing it, thousands walked straight into Annas's empire. And as he looked over his kingdom, did he believe he was serving God? Or had he crowned himself as ruler in God's place? This is the dark stage where the final chapter of Caiphas and Annas would unfold, and where their untouchable world would come crashing down. Their rise to power was only the beginning of a much darker narrative. A tale of betrayal, ambition, and death that would ultimately lead to their own demise. But what fate awaited them after they played their part in condemning Jesus to the cross? Would the same strings they pulled to condemn the Savior now be pulled to bring about their own end? The answer, as we'll soon discover, is far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The temple in all its grandeur was not merely a place of worship. To Annas and his family, it was a personal business empire. It was a carefully orchestrated system where every pilgrim who came to honor God found themselves caught in the web of Annas' influence. The very first thing a worshiper would encounter upon entering the sacred space was the need for temple coins. Regular money wouldn't do. No. Only special temple-issued currency could be used to make offerings. And who controlled the money changers? Anna's family, of course. They set the exchange rates, taking a hefty cut with every transaction. Need a spotless lamb for sacrifice? No problem. Just pay 5 times what it was worth at the market. Their scheme was flawless. The people were required by law to worship. It was a sacred command, and every prayer, every offering, and every sacrifice made meant more gold flowing into their coffers. While humble families struggled to afford even the simplest sacrifice, Annas's empire grew ever richer. Rome, meanwhile, was perfectly content with this arrangement. All they asked was that peace be maintained, taxes collected, and control be ensured. As long as those things were met, they allowed the high priest to run their affairs as they saw fit. It was the perfect system for those at the top. But then one day, something happened that would shatter their world. A carpenter from Galilee entered their temple. Jesus didn't just teach, he acted. When his eyes fell upon the money changers and the animal sellers, a fire blazed in his gaze. Tables were overturned, coins scattered like fallen leaves, and animals dashed freely through the temple. "My house shall be called a house of prayer," he proclaimed, for all to hear. "But you have made it a den of thieves." Can you picture the fury that must have surged through Annas when he heard those words? This wasn't just an insult to their business. It was a direct challenge to their authority. And worse, people were listening. They weren't just hearing his words. They were following him, believing him, and worshiping him. How could this carpenter, this troublemaker, dare to challenge the very system that held everything together? When your power and wealth are threatened, what do? For Annas and Caiphas, there was only one solution: silence him. But it had to be done carefully. Too many eyes were watching. They couldn't afford to make a public spectacle of it. Not when so many believed in him. They needed a quiet, discreet way to get rid of this Galilean, so they devised their plan. A secret trial. False witnesses. A swift execution. Easy, simple, problem solved. But what they failed to realize in their arrogance was this: they weren't just fighting against a man, they were fighting against God himself. They believed they were silencing a troublemaking teacher. But in truth, they were setting into motion events that would unravel their entire empire and lead to a fate far worse than they could ever have imagined. Take a moment to think about this. Annas and Caiphas were more committed to their wealth and power than to recognizing the truth standing before them, the Son of God himself. In their eyes, their position and riches meant more than salvation. They thought they could get rid of Jesus without consequence. But in reality, they were digging their own graves. If you've ever experienced God's protection in the midst of opposition, leave a comment below with the phrase, "God defends the innocent." Your words may be the encouragement someone needs to hear today. Just as God protected his Son, he defends those who stand firm in faith, even when powerful forces rise against them. Every one of your comments will be lifted up in prayer. And your story could be the light someone else needs in their darkest hour. Throughout history, God has always protected his followers. But he has also ensured that those who oppose his will face the consequences of their actions. Caiphas and Annas were about to learn this truth in the most devastating way possible. Their punishment would not simply be a political setback. It would be a lesson in God's justice, one that would come crashing down on them when they least expected it. What happened to these men who thought they could silence God's plan? The answer lies in the night of Jesus' trial, where God's truth shattered everything they had worked so hard to build. Have you ever wondered what really happened when Jesus faced his accusers in that dark, fateful hour? The trial that would change the world broke nearly every Jewish law, turning the justice system upside down. Let's walk into that room, where Annas and Caiphas thought no one was watching, and see how their desperate attempts to condemn Jesus would lead to their own downfall. Jewish law was clear. Trials could only take place during daylight, never at night, and certainly not during the festival. There had to be proper defense, and the witnesses must agree. But Annas and Caiphas didn't care about the law. They cared only about getting rid of Jesus. They wanted results, no matter the cost. Imagine this scene. Jesus is dragged through the silent streets of Jerusalem under the cover of darkness, his hands bound. The high priest's chamber is dimly lit, with flickering oil lamps casting long shadows over the men gathered there. This was no formal courtroom. There were no charges, no defense. Just powerful men hidden in darkness, ready to pass judgment. Bring in the witnesses! Caiaphas commands, his voice cutting through the quiet. One by one, witnesses come forward to testify against Jesus. But something strange happens. Something unexpected. Their testimonies don't match. Under Jewish law, at least 2 witnesses had to agree in order to sentence someone to death. But these men couldn't even get their stories straight.
One witness claims, he said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But another contradicts, no, he said something about a temple not made with hands. With each conflicting testimony, Caiaphas' frustration grows. Every moment passes and his plan begins to unravel. But through it all, Jesus remains silent. He doesn't defend himself, doesn't argue, doesn't plead. His silence speaks volumes. It unnerves them more than any words ever could. You can almost picture Caiaphas pacing back and forth, his carefully laid plans disintegrating before his eyes. The morning light is nearing. Soon the streets of Jerusalem will be filled with people. Time is running out. In desperation, Caiphas breaks another sacred law. He directly questions Jesus. Standing before the accused, Caiaphas's voice rises, his anger barely contained. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The room falls into a tense silence. Even the flickering lamps seem to hesitate. Jesus looks directly at his accuser. His words are calm, deliberate, but they carry the weight of eternity. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven." A gasp echoes through the room. Everyone there knows exactly what Jesus has just said. He is claiming to be God himself. He has just quoted Daniel's prophecy about the divine Messiah. And in that moment, Caiaphas's world shatters. He tears his robes in a dramatic gesture of horror. What do we need witnesses for? You have heard his blasphemy. But what Caiaphas doesn't realize is that in his blind rush to condemn Jesus, he is fulfilling ancient prophecies. Prophecies that had been written long before his time. Isaiah had foretold that the Messiah would be oppressed, afflicted, and yet remain silent before his accusers. Jesus' silence, his words, his very presence, they were all fulfilling the Scriptures. How often do we too find ourselves rushing to judgment, not realizing that God's plan is already in motion? The men who sought to destroy Jesus were blinded by their own power and ambition. They thought they were in control, but in reality, they were part of a story written long before their time. A story that would ultimately see God's justice prevail. Have you ever felt like those who oppose you are winning, only to later see God's hand of justice revealed? Leave a comment below with the words, "God's justice prevails." If you've ever witnessed God defend you in ways that left you in awe, your testimony might just inspire someone who is struggling to see God's hand in their own life. The greatest irony in all of this, just weeks after the crucifixion, Peter would stand in the heart of the same city, perhaps even before some of the same men who had condemned Jesus, and boldly declare, "You killed the author of life," in Acts 3:15, but God raised him from the dead. Can you imagine the shock on the faces of those priests who had thought they had put an end to the problem? How could they ever fathom that the very thing they believed would silence Jesus was the catalyst for the greatest movement in history? They thought they had succeeded, that the nails and wood of the cross and the sealed tomb would be enough to forever silence this troublemaking Galilean. But something strange and terrifying began to unfold. The moment Jesus breathed his last, the events that followed would send an icy chill through the very bones of Anna and Caiaphas, the men who believed their power was unshakable. What do you think goes through the minds of powerful men when nature itself seems to rise up in protest against their actions? From a safe distance, Annas and Caiaphas stood by, watching as Jesus hung on the cross, certain that the problem was dying right before their eyes. They had won, or so they thought. The nails had pierced his hands. The Roman soldiers had ensured he was dead, and the tomb had been sealed. Everything was done. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Then at noon, when the sun should have been at its highest, darkness fell across the land. It wasn't just the usual clouds or a fleeting shadow. It was a thick, suffocating darkness that lasted for 3 whole hours. The streets of Jerusalem fell eerily silent. People stopped in their tracks, their gazes lifted toward the sky in confusion and fear. In the temple, priests exchanged looks of bewilderment. "It's just a dust storm." Caiaphas might have tried to reassure them, but his voice likely trembled as he spoke the words. But then Jesus cried out one last time, and he died. The world stood still, and at that very moment, the ground beneath Jerusalem began to tremble. It wasn't just a gentle shake. It was a violent earthquake, so powerful that it sent people fleeing into the streets. The very earth seemed to react, to rebel against what had just been done. Something was happening, something that no man, not even Annas or Caiphas could control. But the most terrifying part of all inside the temple, the massive veil that separated the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could enter once a year, suddenly tore in two. This wasn't just any curtain. This was a 60-foot tall veil, thick as a man's hand, and it separated God's presence from the people. The moment it tore from top to bottom, the very thing that made Caiaphas and his family feel indispensable was destroyed. The barrier that had kept the people at a distance from God lay in ruins. Imagine the panic that must have set in. A temple worker, pale and breathless, would have run to Caiaphas with the news. The veil, it just tore itself apart. This wasn't just a strange event. This was personal. The veil wasn't just a physical barrier. It represented their exclusive access to God. It was the cornerstone of their power, the very thing that made them necessary in the eyes of the people. Without it, what were they? What power did they truly have? Caiphas and Annas had thought that by silencing Jesus, they would maintain their control. But instead, they had just witnessed the first signs that their power, along with their very connection to God, was being torn apart. The moment they thought they had sealed Jesus as fate was the moment God tore the veil and set his plan into motion, forever altering the course of history. What do you think was going through Caiaphas's mind in that moment? How did he reconcile the very thing he'd feared most? God's direct intervention happening right before his eyes. Perhaps it was in that instant that he realized the power he had fought so desperately to protect was already slipping away. And this time, nothing he did could stop it. But the strangest reports were yet to come. As the night settled over Jerusalem, whispers began to swirl through the streets. Rumors that sent a shiver through even the most hardened hearts. People who had been dead, righteous men and women known to many, were suddenly seen walking through the city. Matthew 27 minutes and 52 seconds 53 records the unimaginable. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life and appeared to many people. Imagine the terror and disbelief that must have gripped the hearts of those who heard these accounts. Dead people alive again, walking, talking, and sharing their stories with the living. Now picture this news reaching the ears of Annas and Caiphas, the ones who believed they had orchestrated the end of Jesus. These men, so used to wielding control, now heard that the dead were walking. The supernatural signs were unfolding before their very eyes, signs that they had never anticipated, signs that undermined everything they thought they knew about power. The walls of their carefully constructed world were crumbling, and with each new miracle, their grip on control loosened further. In a frenzy, they rushed to Pilate, their fear palpable. "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days, I will rise again.' We must secure the tomb. Give the order to keep it safe until the 3rd day," they pleaded, desperate to protect what little authority they had left. Pilate, perhaps indifferent or too preoccupied to care, agreed. Guards were posted. A Roman seal was placed on the stone, ensuring that no one could enter or leave without drawing attention. It was a foolproof plan, or so they thought. Yet, when Sunday morning arrived, everything changed. The guards who had been stationed at the tomb rushed into Caiaphas's home, their faces pale and trembling, their voices filled with panic. "The stone has been moved." They stammered the tomb is empty. But that wasn't all. They spoke of a blinding light, an otherworldly force, and beings of immense power that caused them to fall as though dead men. What could they possibly say to explain such an encounter? How could they describe the feeling of standing before something far greater than themselves? Without missing a beat, Caiaphas acted. He pulled out a heavy bag of silver coins and pressed it into the guard's hands. "Take this money," he ordered coldly. "Tell everyone that his disciples came during the night and stole the body while you were sleeping." The guards, likely in shock, took the money. They agreed to the lie. The deception spread quickly throughout Jerusalem. Jesus' disciples had stolen the body. No one would suspect anything else. But deep down, Caiphas and Annas knew the truth. No amount of silver could stop the movement that had begun. The resurrection of Jesus was the spark, and nothing they did could extinguish it. How often do we try to cover up the truth, hoping that money, power, or lies will protect us from the consequences of our actions? But no matter how hard we try, God's truth always finds a way to shine through, unstoppable and uncontainable. What do you think drove these men to such lengths to protect their positions? Were they truly blind to the power at work, or were they simply unwilling to accept the truth? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. How do you think fear and power influenced their decisions? What Caiphas and Annas failed to understand was that no amount of silver, no lie, and no manipulation could stop what was coming next. God's plan was unfolding, and the resurrection was just the beginning. The stone had been rolled away, and with it, the foundation of their empire began to crumble, and the world as they knew it would never be the same again. How quickly can a powerful family lose everything they've built? For Annas and Caiphas, the answer came with shocking speed, faster than anyone could have ever imagined. Just 7 weeks after they believed, they had solved their Jesus problem. The city of Jerusalem erupted with a new unstoppable movement. At Pentecost, the very disciples who had once cowed in fear now stood boldly in the temple courts, proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Peter, the same man who had denied Jesus in the courtyard, now preached without hesitation, without fear, and with a confidence that startled everyone who heard him. The people listened in awe, and thousands gathered to hear the message. These men are speaking about the mighty works of God in our own languages. People marveled as they heard the apostles speaking in tongues. The miracle didn't stop there. A man who had been crippled from birth was suddenly healed right in front of the temple entrance. He leapt to his feet, dancing and praising God, and the crowd that had gathered grew even larger in amazement. It was a living testimony to the power of God in Jesus' name. All eyes turned to Peter and John, and Peter, without hesitation, boldly proclaimed, "It is Jesus' name and the faith that comes through him that has completely healed this man." For everyone to hear, Peter made it clear that the miracle wasn't due to their power, but solely through Jesus Christ. Caiphas, enraged and desperate to control the situation, ordered the guards to arrest the apostles, thinking that a night in prison would quiet them down. But when the apostles were brought before the same council that had condemned Jesus, Peter spoke with unshakable courage. "It is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, but whom God raised from the dead, that this man stands before you healed." The priests were stunned. These were ordinary men, uneducated, unsophisticated, yet they spoke with a power that no one could deny. And there, standing before them, was the healed man, a living, breathing testimony to the power of Jesus' name. The priests had no choice but to let them go, though they issued a stern warning. But the warnings didn't stop the apostles. Neither did the beatings. Every time the apostles were arrested, they returned to preaching the gospel with even greater zeal. When they were flogged, they left the temple courts, rejoicing that they had been counted worthy to suffer disgrace for the name of Jesus. Nothing had stopped them. But the worst blow for Annas and Caiphas was the movement's unrelenting growth. Acts 6-7 tells us that the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. And even more concerning for the priests, many of their own priests became obedient to the faith. Their very own allies were defecting, turning to the new movement that threatened to undo everything they had built. Meanwhile, Rome began to take notice. Pilate had already sent reports about the crucifixion and the strange events that followed. But now thousands of Jews were gathering daily, proclaiming a risen king. To the Romans, this sounded more like rebellion than religious fervor. Their reports would soon make it clear Jerusalem was simmering with unrest. And the last thing the Roman authorities wanted was another uprising. Annas and Caiphas thought they could silence the threat with a trial, a crucifixion, and a tomb sealed shut. But what they failed to realize was that Jesus' death was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The very thing they had tried to crush was rising up stronger than ever. And no matter how much they tried to suppress it, they could no longer control what God was doing. Have you ever witnessed something that seemed to be dying, only to see it rise again, even more powerful than before? Leave a comment below with the phrase, "God's plan is unstoppable." If you've ever seen God turn what seemed like a defeat into a victory, just as the apostles boldly stood in the face of opposition, God's plan will always prevail, no matter the obstacles. Caiaphas had promised Rome one thing above all: peace and control. In return, he had been granted power, status, and influence. But now that very peace and control was slipping through his fingers. His position grew more precarious with each passing month, as the movement he had tried so desperately to silence continued to grow. The grip that Caiaphas and his family once held over Jerusalem was beginning to loosen. Then in 18 years after Caiaphas had taken office, his world came crashing down. Lucius Vitalis, the Roman governor of Syria, arrived in Jerusalem, a man who had seen enough. He had watched the unrest simmering in the city and the political instability that had followed in the wake of Caiaphas' leadership. In one swift, devastating move, Vitellius stripped Caiaphas of his position as high priest. The mighty son-in-law of Annas, once an untouchable figure, was publicly humiliated. The man who had torn his robes in righteous anger now had his sacred garments ripped away from him. The man who had sat in judgment over others was now judged himself and found wanting. With Caiaphas gone, Rome tightened its grip on Jerusalem. The Annas dynasty, once so powerful and influential, began to crumble. One by one, their special privileges and powers slipped away. The family that had controlled Jerusalem's religious life for decades now watched in helplessness as their authority drained away piece by piece. What had once seemed unshakable was now nothing more than a distant memory. For Caiaphas, the final blow came when he was summoned to Rome to answer for his failures. He who had once commanded others with an iron fist was now bound in chains, forced to travel to the heart of the empire to explain himself to emperors who had no patience for failed puppets. The man who had dictated the fate of many now found himself at the mercy of those more powerful than him. But political disgrace was just the beginning of their troubles. What Caiphas and Annas had never fully understood was that their power had always been fleeting. They thought they could control the narrative, silence the truth, and secure their place at the top. But God's plan couldn't be stopped by mere politics or human manipulation. The downfall of Caiaphas and his family was a testament to how quickly human power can fade, especially when it stands in opposition to the will of God. What happens when the walls we've built around ourselves begin to crumble? How do we respond when the world we've relied on for security and control slips away? Caiphas and Annas learned the hard way that no amount of power, no matter how deeply rooted, could withstand God's sovereign hand. What if your name became forever linked with a terrible, haunting end? For Annas and Caiphas, this became their reality. The stories of their deaths were told and retold in early Christian communities, spreading like wildfire as stark and powerful examples of God's unyielding justice. Ancient Christian writings paint a gruesome picture of what befell Annas after his fall from power. According to these accounts, the once mighty high priest was arrested and bound for transport to Rome. But this was no ordinary binding. His captors wrapped him in wet oxhide, a material known for its unique property. It shrinks dramatically as it dries. As the journey dragged on under the scorching sun, the oxhide began to tighten. Slowly, painfully, hour by hour, the leather began to shrink, squeezing tighter and tighter around Annas' body. What had started as a mere inconvenience soon turned into excruciating agony. The once powerful priest who had commanded the highest religious office in Jerusalem was now at the mercy of his bonds. First came the pain, sharp and relentless, and then the crushing pressure that made it nearly impossible for him to breathe. Those who chronicled these events spoke of the horror of his final moments, his body slowly suffocating, crushed by the very ropes that had bound him. Annas, the man who had once ruled with authority, died alone, far from his home, in unimaginable agony. His death, once considered untouchable, became a warning to all who would stand in defiance of God's justice. His end was not just a political fall. It was a divine reckoning, a punishment so fitting that it echoed through Christian communities for generations. The man who had sat in judgment of others, who had wielded his power with such cruelty, now met his fate in a way that mirrored his actions. Caiphas, too, would face his own reckoning. But Annas' demise remains a chilling reminder of how quickly the mighty can fall when they oppose the will of God. In the end, their names became synonymous with judgment and divine retribution. What does it feel like to know that your legacy will forever be tied to the consequences of your actions? How does one reconcile the power they once held with the inevitable justice that follows those who misuse it? Caiaphas' end was different, yet equally disturbing in its own right. While Annas' death was brutal and physical, Caiaphas' fate was one of emotional and spiritual decay. Early traditions tell us that after losing his position and power, he fell into a deep, consuming despair. The weight of his actions, the knowledge that he had condemned an innocent man to death, perhaps even the Son of God, crushed his spirit in ways no political loss or earthly disgrace could. As the years passed, the burden of guilt weighed heavier on Caiaphas. Some accounts say that he wandered in misery, unable to find peace, tormented by the enormity of his actions. Every step seemed to lead him further into darkness, with the memory of what he had done forever etched in his mind. And ultimately, unable to escape the relentless guilt, he took his own life. The man who had once held immense power, who had stood in judgment over others, now faced the consequence of that judgment in the most tragic way. These men condemned Jesus to die on a cross. Christians would whisper to each other, recounting the stories passed down through generations. And look how God dealt with them in the end. It wasn't just the loss of position or the fall from power that was their punishment. It was the eternal weight of guilt that came from rejecting the very Savior they had condemned. For Caiaphas, there was no escape, no redemption, no peace. In the end, the fate of Caiaphas became a warning, a cautionary tale about the consequences of standing in opposition to God's plan. While Annas' death was swift and violent, Caiaphas' was drawn out, a slow unraveling of the man's soul, proving that God's justice doesn't always come in the form we expect. Sometimes the greatest punishment is the torment we face within, the gnawing guilt that follows us when we refuse to acknowledge the truth. Have you ever felt the weight of guilt for something you couldn't undo? Leave a comment below with the phrase, "God's justice brings peace." If you've ever experienced the weight of wrongdoing, only to find peace when you finally surrendered it to God. Caiaphas' story shows us that no amount of power or success can shield us from the consequences of our actions. Only God's mercy can heal what guilt cannot fix. These stories served a powerful purpose in early Christian communities. They were a vivid reminder that no matter how mighty a person or family may seem, they could not escape the justice of God. The mighty priests, once lords over Jerusalem's religious life, were reduced to cautionary tales. No matter how much power they wielded, their actions would eventually be revealed, and their fate would be sealed by the same divine hand they tried to defy. In 1990, archaeologists made a stunning discovery that brought new weight to these ancient accounts. In Jerusalem, they unearthed an ornate burial box with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas, inscribed on it. Inside the box were the bones of a man in his 60s. This remarkable find confirmed that the biblical Caiaphas was indeed a real historical figure, lending further credibility to the stories of his rise and fall. But while this discovery brought historical validation, it did nothing to change the spiritual lessons his story taught. The fate of Caiphas and Annas and their family remained a profound warning for generations to come. But the final judgment on these priests and everything they had built came in AD 70, exactly as Jesus had predicted. The Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem, tightening their grip on the city. After a brutal siege that starved thousands, the Romans finally broke through the walls. With relentless force, soldiers stormed the temple, the very place where Annas and Caiaphas had once reigned supreme. The golden temple, the pride of the Jewish nation, was set ablaze, the flames so intense that the gold melted between the stones. The Roman soldiers, driven by greed, tore the building apart, stone by stone, to collect the melted treasure. Not one stone was left standing upon another, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy to the letter. Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Matthew 24:2. The priestly families who had once lived in unimaginable luxury lost everything. Their wealth, their status, their very way of life were consumed in flames and blood. The sacrificial system they had long controlled was obliterated forever. The temple, the heart of their power, disappeared from the earth. The dynasty that Annas had built, that Caiaphas had fought so fiercely to protect, was all gone. Their names still lived on, but not as they would have wished. Instead of being remembered as great religious leaders, they became cautionary figures, examples of what happens when men arrogantly fight against God's divine plan. How many times do we see people build their power, their wealth, or their influence only to have it crumble when it's built on the wrong foundation? Caiphas and Annas thought they could secure their legacy by opposing God's will. But in the end, they became symbols of failure, reminders that no one can escape the justice of God. The truth is, God's plan will always prevail, and no earthly power can stand against it. But perhaps the most shocking thing about these men, Annas and Caiaphas, isn't how they died. It's what their lives accidentally accomplished. Despite their efforts to thwart God's plan, their actions played an irreplaceable role in fulfilling it. They thought they were silencing Jesus, but in reality, they were setting the stage for the greatest act of redemption the world would ever know. Yet, the story doesn't end with their deaths. There was one more player in this divine drama: Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who ultimately sealed Jesus' fate with a simple ritualistic gesture. He washed his hands in front of the crowd, claiming he was innocent of Jesus' blood. But what happens when the man who judges God's Son faces God's judgment himself? Pilate believed he could absolve himself of guilt. He thought that by washing his hands, he could wash away the responsibility of condemning an innocent man. But no amount of water could cleanse the weight of what he had done. Pilate's nightmare began the moment he sentenced Jesus, and it only grew more terrifying with each passing day. His political career, once powerful and steady, began to crumble faster than the very walls of Jerusalem. What had started as a mere act of convenience to appease the crowd spiraled into his own ruin. But it wasn't just his political downfall that left an impact. The final moments of Pilate's life were so shocking, so disturbing, that ancient historians debated whether to even record them. The man who had sentenced the Son of God to die, who had dared to wash away his guilt with a simple act, found himself tormented by something far worse than any earthly punishment. Did you know that Pilate's wife, Claudia, received supernatural warnings? According to ancient texts, she had a dream that haunted her so deeply that she sent a message to Pilate, urging him not to have anything to do with the condemnation of Jesus. "I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him," she said, Matthew 27-19. But Pilate, consumed with his own fears and ambitions, ignored her warning, sealing his own fate and hers as well. The divine message meant to save him went unheard. And what of Pilate's body? According to some accounts, after his death, Pilate's body faced a fate so disturbing that people refused to bury it in their lands. The same man who had sentenced the innocent to death found himself rejected by both God and man. Some traditions suggest he was exiled and died in disgrace, his soul tormented by the weight of his actions. No honor, no peace, no rest, only the haunting knowledge of the role he played in the death of the Savior. Imagine what it must have been like for Pilate standing before the very creator of the universe, believing he could judge him, only to realize too late that the judge himself was being judged. His attempt to wash away his guilt was futile. His nightmares, his crumbling career, and the disgrace that followed him into death were all part of the divine justice that catches up to those who stand against God, says Will. Have you ever seen someone try to wash away their guilt, only to find that no matter what they do, it cannot be erased? Leave a comment below with the phrase, "God's justice is inevitable." If you've witnessed someone face the consequences of their actions, or if you've experienced a moment where you realize that God's justice will always find its way, Pilate's story reminds us that no one can escape divine justice. And sometimes the consequences are far more terrifying than we can ever imagine. As we reflect on the fates of Annas, Caiphas, and Pontius Pilate, we are reminded that no one, no matter how powerful or influential, can escape the reach of God's justice. Their lives, filled with ambition, pride, and attempts to manipulate God's plan, ultimately led them to tragic ends, but also fulfilled a purpose far beyond their understanding. The actions they took in defiance of God set into motion a chain of events that would change the world forever, proving that God's will is unstoppable, no matter how fiercely man fights against it. Annas and Caiphas thought they could silence Jesus, but their names will forever be linked to consequences of rejecting God's Son. Pilate, who believed he could wash away his guilt, found that no amount of water could cleanse the blood on his hands. Their stories serve as stark reminders that God's justice will always prevail, and no earthly power can alter his divine plan. But there's hope in the message of their downfall. For in the ultimate act of divine justice, Jesus' death on the cross, came the ultimate gift of mercy and grace. While these men faced judgment for their actions, Jesus took on the punishment they deserved, offering forgiveness and redemption to all who would accept it. His sacrifice turned the greatest injustice into the greatest act of love. So, as we close this chapter of history, let us remember that no matter the challenges we face or the power we might think we hold, God's plan is bigger and His justice is perfect. May we always align ourselves with His will, knowing that His grace is greater than any mistake we've made, and that His justice is both righteous and full of mercy. If you've ever experienced God's justice, His grace, or His mercy in your life, leave a comment below with the phrase, "God's justice and mercy prevail." Let us stand together in awe of His plan and walk in the truth that His will always be done.